it's a summary of a commentator on the Wikileaks disclosures. Okay, the really surprising thing about the Wikileaks revelations is that they contained no surprises. Didn't we learn exactly what we expected to learn? We can no longer pretend we don't know what everyone knows we know. The Wikileaks disclosures brings us face to face with the shameless cynicism of a global order whose agents, the American Imperium, only imagine that they believe in their ideas of democracy, human rights, and so on. The shame, our shame for tolerating such power over us, is made more shameful by being publicised. I'd like to have your comment, please, on that.
Well, I would endorse the general sentiment, of course. I think, what's at stake is a matter of salience. And, of course, we here are gathered to discuss political issues. Probably most people in our society have relatively very little time to spend on considering politics. They're probably more worried about keeping their jobs, where they're going to go on holiday, their children at school, etc. The achievement of the Wikileaks disclosures and the very fruitful collaborations with mainstream media, I think, has been to bring that kind of general awareness of the way the world is operating from the back of our minds to the front of our minds. And once it has spent some time in the front of our minds, it then enters into the kind of meaning structures that we use in order to slot in new developments and make sense out of them. And I think thanks to the Wikileaks disclosures, and I certainly would include the famous video of the US helicopter attack on civilians in Iraq, it has certainly become a much more weighty undertaking for any government to commit openly to joining the United States in another war in somewhere like the Middle East. And the travails of the Cameron government in Britain and the knots in which it has tied itself in attempting to justify its incursions in that area, I think testify to how difficult it is now felt to be politically to kind of try and get away with that kind of policy. And Wikileaks has played a part, therefore, in strengthening that safeguard against the continued repetition of this highly dangerous and destructive tactic.
Were there no surprises in WikiLeaks releases? Maybe for people who already had a pretty good understanding of the way the US empire works, but I think for some of the rest of us, there were surprises. And for me personally, even though you've got the general idea about what's going on, actually reading cables and reading the Iraq war logs and the Afghan war diaries, reading the language that's used, reading the way that these people talk to each other, I think is very powerful in itself, because it makes you very, very angry and it makes you want to do something. There were certainly a lot of things that we didn't know that have been revealed by WikiLeaks, particularly about US wars. So, for example, the order in Iraq, the secret order that was given to US forces not to investigate torture there, the existence of a secret commando unit in Afghanistan, a kill-capture unit hunting down members of the Taliban, and of course the collateral murder video which Jake mentioned, which I think is so powerful to watch. Not because we don't know that these things go on, but because we so rarely see it like that. And the way the Americans talk to each other in that video, describing the scene of carnage after 12 civilians have been killed by 30mm cannon fire, describing that scene as nice, congratulating themselves on all the dead bastards on the ground. I think that really helps people to understand the true nature of war and what happens when you dehumanize people, you dehumanize people and you train them to kill. And I do think that there were changes that came about because of the WikiLeaks releases and because of Cablegate, obviously what happened in Tunisia. And that was the case. The quote that you started with was very interesting, and that was a point that was made by Julian Assange in an interview a few years ago in relation to Tunisia, that everybody in Tunisia knew how corrupt the Ben Ali regime was, but when the WikiLeaks cables came out, they knew, and the Tunisian regime knew that they knew, and the Americans knew that the people knew, and that acted as arguably a restraint on the ability of the Americans to interfere in that situation, as they may have done. They may have intervened and they couldn't really, so yeah.
Paul Rubner. I want to congratulate the speakers on their presentations, very informative and insightful. And the book WikiLeaks Files, very important, I think, not least as a case study in how WikiLeaks cables have been used by journalists to bring out the story. Because it's one thing to have the raw data, it's another thing to bring out the story and thus inform people. I think it's a very valuable piece of research and a resource for journalist research. My question is addressed mainly to Linda. There are claims that the US bombing of the Médecins Sans Frontières hospital in Kunduz recently in Afghanistan constitutes a war crime. What do you think of the possibility that it could be brought before a court of law? And if not, is it a suitable case to be brought before a tribunal like the Russell Tribunal or some special tribunal set up by Citizens Initiative?
I've read different legal opinions about whether that particular attack amounts to a war crime or not. I'm not an international criminal lawyer, but as I understand it, if it can be proven that the Americans either deliberately targeted the hospital or they were trying to hit another target, but they didn't take sufficient care to ensure that there, what's the terminology, to ensure that the damage to civilians wasn't excessive, then yes, it's a war crime. But one of the problems, I think, with international humanitarian law is that it actually does allow for a significant amount of civilian casualties. Just because there's civilian casualties doesn't necessarily mean that it's a war crime, and just because they bombed a hospital doesn't necessarily, as far as I know, mean that it's a war crime, and Jake might be able to clarify this. So will it be brought before a court of law? I guess the Americans could prosecute themselves for the act. I think that's unlikely. In relation to the International Criminal Court, Afghanistan is quite interesting because it is a member of the court, and there's been a preliminary investigation into the situation there for I think 8 years now, but it's not moved to a full investigation. Afghanistan has also signed a bilateral immunity agreement with the United States, so it would be very interesting to see what happened if the ICC attempted to extradite somebody, an American from Afghanistan, in relation to that. So, and the Russell Tribunal, I don't really know anything about that, so I don't know if Jake does, or if you can maybe comment on that.
I think Russell tribunals and people's tribunals are useful in again, doing the same sort of thing, keeping that in the public eye. Not letting it slip away, generating attention, generating further media coverage, and bringing it to prominence. The principle enshrined in the Fourth Geneva Convention is that the risk of harm to protected persons must be in proportion to the value of the military objective sought. And going back to the first explanation that the Taliban were using the grounds of the hospital as a base from which to fire on targets of various kinds, was, I think, intended to be the makings of a defence against, or prospective defence against, that kind of allegation, that it was a disproportionate use of force. Indeed, one member of the British government resigned last summer, last year, over the refusal of David Cameron to use the word disproportionate to describe Israel's actions in Gaza for that very reason, which I think is quite interesting. But yeah, People's Tribunal, great. Let's keep the pressure on.
Thank you. I've got a follow-up comment on that. The hospital in Kunduz, they were informed that they were bombing the hospital, and they kept it up for half an hour. So that is something I think that actually does point toward the war crime, that they didn't stop.
Brian, I'm Karen. My question's to both speakers. First of all, I'd just like to say happy birthday to Vladimir Putin. Congratulations for kicking the arse of ISIS, because you can't rely on Obama and the coalition who are willing to do anything against them. They work in cohesion, it seems. But I'd just like to ask, have any WikiLeaks cables come out about the chemical weapons attack on the Syrian public that was blamed on Assad? And as well, the takedown of MH17 that they tried to stitch up Putin for, that actually there was a Ukrainian jet following. Anything about that, or could you add anything?
Not as far as I know. Sorry.
I mean, just the one curiosity about that investigation into the MH17 crash, which is, I believe I'm right in saying, that there are 4 governments involved in it, one of them being the Ukrainian government, and that there's an agreement in place that no information will be disclosed about that investigation without the consent of all 4 of those governments, which, given that the Ukrainian government is, as you say, one possible suspect in that crime, would be seem a rather odd way to go about a criminal investigation.
What are the other 3?
Australia, the Netherlands, and somebody else.
Malaysia.
Is it Malaysia, of course, yeah.
What a team.
Okay, who's next, please? Going back to the 1990s with the war involving the breakup of former Yugoslavia, certainly in Western countries we got some very one-sided, very simplistic reporting during that era. So I was wondering whether there's been any revelations with cables and so on in recent years about the truth of what was happening, which a lot of it which wasn't reported at the time.
US diplomatic cables released by WikiLeaks, the Cablegate batch, like I said before, really just starts in the first decade of this century, so there's nothing from that period. Whether there may be cables that talk about the conflict there, I've not read them, so there's like 250,000 cables. So yeah, I've read about 6,000, but not quite read all of them yet, so sorry, I don't know.
Not specifically about WikiLeaks cables, but I do still meet quite a lot of people who make statements about the conflict over Kosovo in particular, which reflect, I think, the kind of intense propaganda from the time. On the eve of NATO's bombing of Yugoslavia in the so-called Kosovo crisis, Tony Blair, the then UK Prime Minister, told the British Parliament that it would have the aim of averting a humanitarian crisis. Now, at that time, March 1999, what had happened was that there had been the flaring of a conflict, an armed conflict in and around the territory the previous year, the middle of 1998, which had displaced some thousands of people from their homes, and they were therefore on the move. But as a German government investigation at the time showed, by March 1999 they'd all gone back home again. The Kosovo verification mission of the Organisation for Security Cooperation in Europe had overseen a withdrawal from the territory of the Yugoslav army units, but it had a lopsided brief. It was not briefed to do anything about the Kosovo Liberation Army, which was therefore using those revetted positions to strike at Serbian targets. But nonetheless, the territory was not in the grip of a humanitarian crisis at that time. What triggered the humanitarian crisis was the onset of NATO's bombing, because that's what caused thousands of people to flee, and that's what gave rise to the memorable images of them pouring across the borders of the neighbouring territories of Macedonia and Albania. That was the first humanitarian crisis, and that was then reversed when they all went home again at the end of NATO's bombing. But the end of NATO's bombing triggered a further humanitarian crisis, which was the expulsion of non-Albanian civilians from the Kosovo territory, running into hundreds of thousands, which has never been reversed. So, on the anniversary of the start of NATO's bombing, a speech in the United States by George Robertson, who by that time had become Lord Robertson. He had left off being the British Defence Secretary, which he was at the time, and he'd become Secretary General of NATO. And the way he put it was that NATO's mission had been to reverse this humanitarian catastrophe. So it went from avert to reverse. And that was the gloss that was then put on it, that NATO had achieved this fantastic accomplishment of reversing the damage which it itself had caused. And that's what people still don't grasp because of the overwhelming weight and intensity of propaganda from the time.
Wow.
I just wanted to take up a slightly different angle. What's happened to Wikileaks since Julian Assange has been basically confined for so long, and maybe, I don't know, Linda in particular could say something about, you know, recent developments with Wikileaks, recent developments of other revelations of secret government cables and so on. I mean, it's right out of my sphere of competence, but I've been watching all the reportage on cyber wars, the escalation of cyber wars between governments, and also in encryption, which I just wonder whether, you know, whether you have information on this. Are governments such as the US taking serious action to make sure that their embassy cables are not going to be available in the future? I strongly suspect they are, and if you could just maybe make some comments about more recent developments in this whole issue of the revelations of government documents and the cyber wars. Thank you.
I don't know much about cyber war. I'm not sure what you mean by that, sorry. But if you, but to take that point about whether the United States is now being extra careful with its cables, I'm sure it is. I don't know the technical details of that, but I'm sure they are. And there's another couple of indications as to how seriously they've taken the threat of whistleblowers since not only the revelations of Chelsea Manning, but also, of course, Edward Snowden. So just the way that the US government has approached this, you know, Obama has, it's said a lot, but you know, you can't say it often enough, I think, prosecuted more whistleblowers under the US espionage than any other previous presidents, than all previous presidents combined. He also introduced something called the Insider Threat Program. Now, this was a directive that went out to, I think, all US government federal agencies, basically instructing staff to spy on each other. So, you know, if your colleague is you know, looking at salon.com or one of these other, you know, radical websites in their lunch hour instead of CNN or Fox, then these are indications that this person might be an insider threat. So those are two aspects of how the US government has responded. As for what's happening to WikiLeaks now and recent WikiLeaks revelations, well, I think WikiLeaks has had an extraordinary year. Julian Assange being locked up in the embassy, I think, has just made them all the more prolific, and he said himself that, he doesn't have anything else to do. So this year, for example, we had the revelations of a British whistleblower about the British nuclear programme, the Trident submarines. I think it was a 30-odd page report about safety issues with that. We've had the TISA and TPP revelations. So the only reason we know anything about those secret agreements is because of WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks has released several chapters of those agreements. So there was that. There was the Saudi cables as well. Cables from, I think, Saudi intelligence agencies. Revelations of the US government spying on senior French and German officials. And there was the two classified European Union documents that showed that the EU was preparing to attack ships. Yeah, it was planning military interventions against boats travelling from Libya to Italy. So this was basically trying to attempting to stop the flow of migrants from there. So yeah, those are just a few, I think, of the releases this year, and they've also added more cables to the +D, Public Library of US Diplomacy, which includes Cablegate and cables from the 1970s. So does that answer your question?
Pretty good go, thank you. The next question, please.
Good evening, I'm Joffrey Balchi, and my question is that I'd like to explore a different angle. I think terrorism and a lot of problems can be solved if one would actually follow the money trail. Who finances them and who makes financial gains? So my question would be, to what extent is Wikileaks able and willing to explore that angle of the money trail? Because I think through the money trail we will really discover the intricacies of how the military, industrial, financial, and even entertainment complex works. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, I guess WikiLeaks would have to receive documents pertaining to what you were saying. Yeah, and it would be up to them whether they publish those documents or not. So yeah, but I mean, a lot of the stuff in the US diplomatic cables certainly relates to the US relationship with corporations. There's stuff in there about the TPP, and there's a lot of stuff about how US diplomats act on behalf of big American corporations. So for example, in Europe, trying to persuade Europeans to accept GMOs, genetically modified organisms. Yeah, and so there's quite a lot of examples of that, but
I'll just make the observation that people will have heard me make here before, that when the NATO operation in Yugoslavia was underway in 1999 that I was just referring to, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe was General Wesley Clark, and in Wesley Clark's memoir he recalls meeting a desk general at the Pentagon who informed him that we're going to knock over 7 regimes in 5 years, and they included Iraq, Iran, Libya, Syria, Sudan. I'm sure you can imagine the others. I can't remember exactly where. Probably, yeah. But what those regimes all have in common is that they still control strategic resources and use the revenues from those resources to build society and the state. In the case of Syria, both oil and agricultural land, for example. That makes them barriers to capital accumulation. They are perversely and recalcitrantly sitting there in the way of Americans making money out of those resources, and that makes them an enemy. And you can cross-reference that to the phrasing of the National Security Statement issued by the Bush administration in 2002, which is known or it's notorious for its declaration of the right of preemptive self-defense. But it also says that both free elections and free markets constitute the single sustainable model for national success. And the implication is that any deviation from those policies will make the country concerned into a security threat, and that America will strike at such threats, as the document says, before they are fully formed. So that's where the cross-referencing comes, I think. Not necessarily from disclosures by WikiLeaks, but from, it's hiding in plain sight, it's documents in the public record.
Just following on from that, given the change in the international relations in regards to the Syrian crisis, how do you perceive the developments from, for example, the situation that you described in Libya, where Russia and China abstained, and the current situation where that's clearly not the case.
I think Russia, made it pretty clear that while the Gaddafi regime, a little bit like the International Criminal Court, was essentially friendless in the international community, that's certainly not the case with the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Syria is host to a very important strategic asset in Russian hands, namely its Mediterranean naval base. And of course it's also allied with Hezbollah, which is a backbone of resistance to the very Israeli aggression, which I just referred to in my remarks, aimed at Lebanon and its citizens, which has been, prosecuted with deadly effect many times over the years. You see, the situation that is bequeathed by the war in Iraq, for example, is that an American administration or a government of a country allied with the United States is very reluctant to be seen to be engaging in such an overt effort at regime change as that. That there's a risk of political unpopularity making that kind of exercise difficult to sustain. So what is underway, therefore, is a passage of forms in which that kind of effort to destabilise the regime is much more diffuse. Hence, perhaps the rise of drone warfare, for example. If you take a drone, a military drone, in a kind of obvious literal sense, it has component parts, which are metals, plastics, etc. But it also has the implicit component of assumptions about its political context. And the political context is influenced, no doubt, by the very much lesser attention that is generally paid to military operations involving drones than when the same military operations are done by manned aircraft. One of the images that the Bush administration sought to suppress during the war in Iraq, the early stage of the war in Iraq, was the picture published by the newspaper in Seattle showing a number of coffins of US service personnel, each draped with the Stars and Stripes, in the back of a military transporter plane being flown back to America. And that's clearly identified as a risk. We don't want planes shot down and pilots being mourned by their families and conspicuous funerals, etc. That's one reason to push it into the drone space instead. There's a whole battery now of covert tactics for subversion of regimes, for working through layers and layers of proxies. This is what lies behind the kind of grotesque persistence with efforts to arm the Iraqi military, which keep running away when confronted by ISIS forces, who then say, oh, thank you very much, we'll have all these high-tech weapons the Americans have given you until the next time, when it will happen all over again. So there's a definite move towards the covert, the diffuse, take it off the radar, take it out of the public eye, because of the political risks associated with that kind of adventurism, and Wikileaks has contributed to that sense of political risk around them, I think.
Tony Backhouse from Hands Off Syria. There was a big confab yesterday regarding Russia admitting that they accidentally in bad weather crossed the Turkish border with a MiG fighter, and then the NATO tried to say that an unidentified MiG from either Russia or Syria crossed the border and targeted 8 aircraft. Well, the Turkish government had come out today and reported on CNN that actually 8 F-16s crossed the Syrian border and were targeted by ground-to-air radar. So it's amazing how the story gets misconstrued.
Have you got a question at all there?
Oh, well, just a statement, because we've just been told that Russia has been transgressing the Turkish airspace, but Davutoglu, who is the legitimate leader of Turkey, as opposed to Erdogan, who's just a titular head, he hasn't got any constitutional powers. That's why they're rerunning the election, because they wouldn't allow a minority coalition, because they want to make him an executive president, a caliph, you might say. But they're having a rerun of the election because they couldn't do that. They couldn't change the constitution, basically.
The question is about, I guess, the mainstream media's relationship with Wikileaks, which Jake touched on And it is certainly true, I think, the point you made is that globally, WikiLeaks has become, a very important source for newspapers around the world, from Tunisia to Brazil to everywhere. And WikiLeaks has provided, so much material. But I wanted to, I guess, to ask more about the issue that WikiLeaks has also been attacked so savagely by sections of the mainstream media, particularly in Australia, US, and Britain, and what that says about, I guess, especially because, for instance, New York Times chose not to, has chosen not to publish things which have been leaked to it on the advice of the US government, whereas WikiLeaks has refused to do that. So yeah, I guess your comment on that, the fact that WikiLeaks as a media organisation has also been criticised very heavily by some of the organisations who are happy to publish the things it provides.
Well, what does that say about the mainstream media? I think it says two things mainly. That they regard WikiLeaks as a competitor in some ways, because what WikiLeaks has done is got past the gatekeepers and just put all this primary sources, all this information out there. So I think in that sense, WikiLeaks has democratised access to information, which I think is really important. And the second thing I think that these attacks on WikiLeaks and the character assassinations of Julian Assange say is that a lot of these media organisations are very close to power. And yeah, we saw that with, I think it was, the New York Times wanted to run their stories on Cablegate past the White House first. So yeah, I think that's what it says.
Okay. Thanks very much. That's the end of the question and answer session. Please thank the speakers and thanks to everybody.